The basis of this theory is that there is a fourth branch in the Zelda timeline that probably split off during the events of Majora's Mask, and that the Zonai appeared in this other timeline. This is the only theory I've been able to find that explains the apparent lore inconsistencies of Tears of the Kingdom seamlessly. Every other theory I've found requires some degree of retconning, or at least has some discrepancies with the established lore. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a lot of ground to cover. Let's get started. The purpose of this theory is to solve an inconsistency in the lore regarding Tears of the Kingdom, specifically regarding the placement of the Zonai era. Basically, all we know about when it was is that it was prior to Hyrule's founding, or alternatively, it was after a kingdom-destroying event from which they rebuilt Hyrule. While the time of the Zonai era is uncertain, there are three main locations in the timeline where theorizers tend to place the Zonai era because they tend to make the most sense overall. However, even these three locations are not without issues. The first location for the Zonai era would be prior to Skyward Sword. This one has an immediate problem, that being that Ganondorf exists in the Zonai era. Now, there have been multiple incarnations of Ganondorf throughout the Zelda series, but Ganondorf is a product of the Curse of Demise. The Curse of Demise causes the ones who hold the blood of the goddess, the spirit of the hero, and the manifestation of hatred to be locked into a cyclical battle for all of time, and Ganondorf is brought into being because of this curse. The Curse of Demise was not instated until the events of Skyward Sword, so Ganondorf couldn't possibly exist prior to Skyward Sword. So the first location for the Zonai era doesn't really make sense. This also rules out the idea that the Zonai were the original founders of Hyrule, so they must have rebuilt it after some kind of kingdom-destroying event. The second location for the Zonai era is after Skyward Sword but before Ocarina of Time. This possibility holds more water than the first, but it still has its holes. One problem is that if the Zonai existed in that era, then there would be two Temples of Time built at the same time, which isn't impossible, but definitely seems unnecessary and potentially problematic to the lore. A second problem is that two Zelda games take place in this time period, and in neither of them is there any evidence of the Zonai's existence. So this timeline placement makes more sense than the first, but it still doesn't really make a lot of sense. The third location for the Zonai era is after the Timeline Convergence, but before Breath of the Wild. This one makes the most sense so far, since there wasn't much established lore in that era to contradict it, but it too doesn't fully hold up, and that's because of the ruins of the converged Hyrule. Throughout the world of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, we see many truly ancient ruins scattered across the map, some of these dating back all the way to Skyward Sword, the first game in the pre-split timeline. And yet all the notable structures from the Zonai era have long since crumbled away. Sure, there are Zonai ruins dotted across Hyrule, particularly in the Faron region and the Typhlo ruins, but it's little more than walls and pillars. The decay of the Zonai kingdom is to the point where we can't figure out where their castle was. If the Zonai existed relatively recently compared to the other games, then we should have seen more of their ruins around. So the third location for the Zonai era doesn't quite work either. And that's why I came up with the shadow timeline theory. It may seem odd to start the discussion of this theory near its chronological conclusion, but the convergence is one of the strangest and most confusing pieces of lore in The Legends of Zelda, and this theory doesn't make any sense at all unless you have at least some basic understanding of what the convergence is and what it isn't. This is difficult to explain concisely though, since nobody really has a firm grip on how the convergence works, including Nintendo and including myself. What we do know about the convergence is that it is an event that occurs at the end of each of the three branched timelines. Over hundreds or thousands of years, fate and the repetitive nature of the Curse of Demise slowly realigned the three timelines until one day they reconjoined and became just one timeline, the same way it was prior to the events of Ocarina of Time. It is important to note that this realignment does not simply cause the three timelines to look identical, the three timelines actually merged into one. We know this because in Breath of the Wild, which takes place after the convergence, instead of seeing the things that make each timeline unique faded away, we see evidence that the history of all three timelines took place within the same world. We see the Rito, which only came into being in the Adult Link timeline, due to their prehistory in Wind Waker. We see the Arbiter's Grounds, which were only built in the Child Link timeline. And we see the Lynels, a species of monstrosity created by Ganon specifically in the Downfall timeline. These are just a few examples of things that only exist in one timeline, but still ended up carrying over into the Converged timeline. Now, the convergence doesn't make logical sense if you compare it to how we normally think about time travel. The idea that multiple timelines could line up to the point where they become the same timeline again, and that all the prior timelines as history are equally valid to the conjoined timeline is something that can't properly be comprehended by the human mind, because at the end of the day, it simply shouldn't work. It opens up this whole can of worms where we have to ask if so-and-so historical thing from whichever timeline actually happened insofar as the conjoined timeline is concerned, because if you went back that far, then there are two other timelines that would disagree with what was going on at that time. Just for a running example, did the Wind Waker flood occur in the history of the converged timeline? Because the converged timeline didn't exist when that flood first took place. It's not a question that has an immediately obvious answer. Looking at the Breath and Tears era of Hyrule, however, we do find an answer. The Rito only exist due to the Wind Waker flood, so the Wind Waker flood must have occurred in some sense. However, there are otherwise very few artifacts of the Wind Waker flood which would suggest that the Wind Waker flood only sort of happened, that it's a myth, and that we can see some evidence of that myth having taken place in the converged era of Hyrule, but it's unclear to what extent it happened. This applies to all the events of the three timelines. Artifacts can be found of those timelines after the convergence, but it's difficult to pinpoint just how fully the events which involved those artifacts actually occurred. The Shadow Timeline theory proposes that the Zonai descended upon Hyrule in one or more other timelines that fed into the convergence alongside the three previously established timelines. The Zonai and their history fed into the converged timeline, thus causing the converged world to bear evidence of the Zonai's existence without that timeline's events ever having properly occurred with regards to the conjoined timeline. Artifacts of this Shadow Timeline, or possibly multiple Shadow Timelines, can be found in the Zonai ruins that dot Hyrule's surface, in the construct factories of the depths, in the Sky Islands, and in Raru's ghost form. Obviously, the established lore only consists of three branches in the timeline, the Child, Adult, and Downfall timelines respectively. So if this theory is going to go anywhere, then we have to establish where another split may have taken place. There are, as it happens, several locations in the Zelda timeline where there could definitely be a hidden timeline split, but there is one potential split location that has a lot of evidence supporting it when compared to the others, that being a Majora's Mask split. To understand how there could be a timeline split off of Majora's Mask, we have to take a look at Ocarina of Time. In Ocarina, we see the splitting of the Child timeline and the Adult Link timeline. This split occurs when the titular Ocarina of Time is used to send Link into the past to relive his childhood. Now, why a split occurs here specifically is tricky to determine, since Link has used the Ocarina many times leading up to this point without, to the best of our knowledge, any other timeline splits occurring, apart from the Downfall timeline, which is its own can of worms. It seems probable, however, that the reason that a split occurred at the end of Ocarina of Time is because the Ocarina was used to send Link back in time, and he didn't use the Ocarina to return to the future. Now, in Majora's Mask, Link is fighting the clock, since there's an apocalypse scheduled for just 3 days after his arrival in Termina. It's more than safe to say that Link canonically must have used the Ocarina of Time to go back in time to the start of that 3-day period at least once. And he doesn't return to the future using the Ocarina. This mirrors how the timeline was split at the conclusion of Ocarina of Time. This heavily implies that in an absolute minimum of one alternate timeline, Link disappeared from the realm of Termina, and Termina was successfully destroyed by Majora. This alternative timeline is what I call a Shadow Timeline, a timeline that is a part of the world of Hyrule, but isn't currently connected to any of the games that we know of. Looking at the Shadow Timeline, the consequences of Majora's success in Termina are hard to judge on a universe-wide scale. It's not clear how connected Termina is to Hyrule, so who knows if Majora's influence would actually ever spread to the main world of the Zelda series. It's entirely possible that the destruction of Termina would have virtually no effect on Hyrule. However, the disappearance of Link prior to Termina's destruction would result in a chain reaction that leads to quite a different future. But to see these consequences, we have to look forward in time by a century or two to get to Twilight Princess. In Twilight Princess, a new incarnation of Link is pitted against Ganondorf and Zant, who are orchestrating the Twilight invasion. This new incarnation of Link, however, is trained by the specter of the previous Link from Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. But in the Shadow Timeline, this specter isn't around, because that Link disappeared from the timeline when he used the Ocarina in Termina. This would lead to the failure of the new Link in Twilight Princess, which would mean that the Twilight invasion would be successful. Remember when I said that the Zonai would have had to descend to Hyrule after some kingdom-destroying event? Well, that's the Twilight invasion. In the Shadow Timeline, it is almost certain that the Twilight invasion would have successfully subjugated Hyrule, and Ganondorf would have then ruled with Zant as his puppet. The Zonai must have descended to Hyrule after the Twilight invasion and opposed Ganondorf and the Twilight forces, and after their victory they re-established the Kingdom of Hyrule. Now at this point you may think that this is getting terribly speculative, but I don't think that you need to concern yourself with that, because this is where we get to the fun part. In Tears of the Kingdom, we are introduced to the character of Queen Sonia, and we are quickly told that Sonia detects a blood connection between herself and Zelda. There's just one problem with that. Sonia doesn't appear to have any children in Tears of the Kingdom. If she didn't have any descendants, then how can she have a blood connection to Zelda? Well, as it happens, it is extremely likely that Queen Sonia is part of the bloodline of Hylia. I say this because of the powers that she possesses. Sonia has a secret stone that augments her magical abilities, but it doesn't create new abilities on its own, which means that Sonia has natural ability in the arcane arts. Now let's look at Sonia's abilities for a second. She can manipulate time, she can transfer her powers to others, she can take on an incorporeal form without the support of a physical body, and she can occasionally perceive information that would not normally be perceivable, like the aforementioned bloodline connection. Now the thing is, every one of these abilities can be found in one iteration of Zelda or another. Time manipulation is practiced by both the reincarnation of Hylia in Skyward Sword and in the most recent iteration of Zelda. Transference of power is practiced by both the Prisoner incarnation in Twilight Princess and once again by the Breath and Tears Zelda. The ability to sustain an incorporeal spirit form is seen in the Zelda in Spirit Tracks, and Sonia's ability to perceive the imperceivable is clearly a mark of the natural connection to the Triforce of Wisdom, and is something practiced by the Zelda of both Four Swords and of Ocarina of Time. Also, have you ever noticed how completely overpowered Breath and Tears Zelda is in the magic department? Anyway, Queen Sonia almost definitely carries the blood of the goddess, and is the Zelda of her timeline in everything other than name. The blood connection that Sonia feels for Zelda then isn't because of a descendancy, because Sonia has no children. This connection is there because the blood of Hylia runs in both of their veins. Now, this is another problem with the three conventional timeline placements. If Queen Sonia is the one who carries the blood of the goddess, and she has no child, and she dies at the hand of Ganondorf, then the lineage of Hylia ends right then and there cannot be any more incarnations of Zelda moving forward from that point. Breath and Tears Zelda's existence refutes this outright. But if Sonia lived in the Shadow Timeline rather than in one of the theorized locations in the Conjoined Timeline, then we have no problem, because the lineage of Hylia would only be extinguished in one branch of the timeline, and Hylia's bloodline only technically needs to survive to the convergence in one timeline. So in this case, the Shadow Timeline theory clears up a plot hole that there was otherwise no explanation for. The Zonai architecture bears some surprising similarities to that of the Twilight. They both bear these greenish line designs, these spiral patterns, and an artistic focus on both an eye and these long serpent-like dragons. The geoglyphs also bear an uncanny similarity to Twilight runes. This all would suggest that the Zonai borrowed a decent amount from the Twilight, which is common of conquering peoples in the real world. The Greeks borrowed ideas from the Persians, and the Romans borrowed ideas from the Greeks, just to name a couple prominent examples. If nothing else, these details would suggest that the Zonai era couldn't have been prior to the events of Twilight Princess. And it's not just their architecture, the Zonai also boast these armlets that bear similar markings and patterns to those naturally found on the Twilight skin. There's a lot of clear evidence that the Zonai borrowed things from Twilight culture, which I think is a pretty big pointer towards this theory. There's another big pointer that suggests that this conflict took place, and that's the placement of armor pieces in Tears of the Kingdom. Now, most of the many armor pieces that can be found in Tears of the Kingdom are found in random rundown mines scattered across the depths. However, there are several pieces of armor notable to this discussion that have very special placement within the depths, those being the 3 pieces of the Evil Spirit armor set, which almost perfectly resembles the armor worn by Phantom Ganon in Ocarina of Time. These 3 pieces are found in the bottommost layers of the 3 great labyrinths that dominate the landscape of Tears of the Kingdom. These pieces of armor are the deepest and most guarded secrets in each labyrinth, and they are not only held behind all 3 mazes in each labyrinth set, but each piece is also guarded by a level 3 flux construct. Now it's easy to forget because there was a big change in the graphics between these two games, but the Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time is the same one as in Twilight Princess, so this armor set is still closely connected to the incarnation of Ganondorf that the Zonai would have fought during their war with the Twili. In no other placement of the Zonai era is there an explanation of why the Zonai would have acquired this set of armor only to have it hidden away and guarded it so thoroughly. In the Shadow Timeline, these armor pieces are evil-imbued artifacts of a great war. It would only be natural for them to make sure that they were well hidden. In the Conjoined Timeline, however, these artifacts of Phantom Ganon either don't exist yet, or they existed so long ago that the Zonai couldn't possibly know anything about them. Yet another piece of evidence in favor of a Twilight Zonai war is the Hylians of the Zonai era. They seem to be quite underdeveloped insofar as their technology. At every known point in the Zelda timeline, converged or branched, Hylians have had a minimum of medieval era technology, but not these Hylians. Their warriors carry simple spears and little to no armor. They have distinctly tribal-looking helmets and headdresses, and their clothing is adequate but simple. Now we know that the Kingdom of Hyrule must have collapsed at some point prior to the Zonai arriving and refounding it, but a collapse in technological progress isn't something that you'd expect out of a kingdom's fall. Sure, the supplies and skilled workers needed to produce certain tech may have been lost, but sending an entire kingdom's population backward into the Bronze Age is unprecedented. Once again, however, this is conveniently explained in the Shadow Timeline. The Twilight invasion saw the Hylian people turned into these spirits, right? Now we don't know how long Ganondorf would have hypothetically reigned over Hyrule with the Twilight, but if it were at least a few generations, with the Hylians meandering as these lesser forms of themselves for dozens of years, then perhaps there would be enough degradation of knowledge to warrant this drastic loss in technological progress. There's another detail I'd like to draw your attention to as well, although this one's not necessarily as strong of evidence. I just think it's a nice little touch that may support this theory a little bit. East of Lurelin Village on the southern shore of Hyrule, there's this monument that looks kind of like the Mirror of Twilight, and it's broken into 4 pieces, same as the Mirror of Twilight, which I think is supposed to suggest a connection there. Now this monument clearly isn't the original Mirror of Twilight, as it's quite a bit smaller and doesn't have the exact same runes on it, but the resemblance is close enough that I think we can safely say that it is some sort of replica. Interestingly enough, it's not built in the Arbiter's grounds, where the original mirror was, but instead it's built in this old collection of Zonai ruins, and it even has an early version of the Zonai script written around its perimeter. I think this strongly suggests that at some point the Zonai were trying to access the Twilight Realm, but that the original mirror was for some reason not available to them. Now when Midna broke the Mirror of Twilight in the normal child timeline, it was because it had become clear that the Hylians and the Twilight could not coexist in the same world, and if the Zonai are half as smart as they let on, then they would recognize this and wouldn't be trying to build portals to the Twilight Realm. But obviously in the context of a Twilight Zonai war, there are many different reasons that the Zonai may have wanted a second way into that realm. And one last thought I had on evidence for this war is simply that there have only ever been a few forces in the history of Hyrule that could have driven a race like the Zonai to near extinction, and the Twilight are one of those forces. Whatever the Zonai were fighting did nearly wipe them out, so that's one small pointer in favor of the Shadow Timeline. Alright, now that we've gotten most of the facts laid out, let's look at how the story of the Shadow Timeline must have played out. While adventuring in Termina, the hero of time uses the Ocarina of Time to travel into the past, leaving the realm of Termina to be destroyed at the hands of Majora. A century or two later, after the sages botch their attempt to execute Ganondorf and the demonic warlord uses Zant to orchestrate the Twilight invasion, a new incarnation of Link, the hero of Twilight, rises to face them. However, without the guidance of the specter of the Hero of Time, the Hero of Twilight fails to bring peace to Hyrule, and the kingdom passes into an age of edginess. Sometime later, the Zonai descend from the heavens to end Ganondorf's tyranny, and a bloody war ensues that eventually sees Ganondorf destroyed, the Twilight banished back to the Twilight Realm, and the Zonai driven to the brink of extinction. With the Twilight invasion finally ended, the surviving Zonai re-established the Kingdom of Hyrule. Peace is not to last, however, as Ganondorf is reborn into the Gerudo tribe. This interestingly parallels how Ganondorf was reborn in Four Swords Adventures, which takes place after the Twilight Princess and the normal child timeline. For all practical purposes, The Ganondorfs of the Shadow Timeline and the Four Swords Adventures are probably the same Ganondorf born into different timelines. After all, they are the only two incarnations of Ganondorf that don't go after the Triforce, and they both use powerful magical artifacts to get a big power-up before they ever meet Link. Four Swords Adventures Ganondorf uses the Trident of Darkness to transform into Ganon, and Shadow Timeline Ganondorf uses a Secret Stone to transform into the Demon King. Anyway, war breaks out between the new Kingdom of Hyrule and the Gerudo tribe, and it's around this time that Zelda arrives from the future. The rest of the story you basically already know. The war is semi-resolved into a shaky peace for about 5 minutes before Ganondorf turns traitor and the imprisoning war ensues. Rauru sacrifices himself to seal Ganondorf away for tens of thousands of years, and Zelda receives the Master Sword from the future and becomes a Light Dragon. Sometime after the convergence, the seal on Ganondorf starts to loosen, and an aspect of his wrath and power escapes and becomes Calamity Ganon. Calamity Ganon is defeated, but it survives to come back 10,000 years later. Calamity Ganon is defeated for good this time by the Breath and Tears iteration of Link and Zelda. And after all of these years, Rauru's seal on Ganondorf finally expires, and what's next is a little game called Tears of the Kingdom. And that's the Shadow Timeline theory. I think it's got some real merits. I think it holds up pretty well, but please feel free to tear it to shreds in the comments if you find any outstanding issues. I would absolutely love to see this debated, to participate in that debate, although with how well my videos do, this probably won't get enough publicity to really have enough people to generate much conversation. That's all for today though. See you later. What, are you sticking around for more? Well, okay. I did have a few thoughts about this theory that didn't really fit in anywhere else, so here goes. If for some reason it becomes apparent that this theory doesn't work as it now stands, it doesn't negate the possibility that the Zonai emerged in a shadow timeline. There are other places in the chronology of The Legend of Zelda where the timeline may have had a hidden split. However, we can't get nearly as detailed with these variations of the theory since it isn't as obvious what the consequences of those splits would be, and because there's not as much obvious evidence for those splits. One alternative timeline split is all the way back at the chronological beginning of the story in Skyward Sword. When Zelda goes back in time, it might create a timeline split because she doesn't use time travel to return to the present, which is how the OG timeline split happened in her Ocarina of Time. However, she does make it back to the present through stasis, and it appears to be the present of the same timeline, so it's hard to say. The device used for time travel in this scenario was the Gate of Time, and it doesn't seem to operate under quite the same rules as the Ocarina. There also may be a timeline split in Oracle of Ages, although I can't pinpoint any specific candidates for spots where it might split because the time travel in that game is just absolutely bonkers. When I was earlier on in trying to figure out this theory, I really wanted the Ganondorf in Tears of the Kingdom and the Shadow Timeline to be the same Ganondorf as in Twilight Princess, because that would clear up a couple of confusing details about Tears of the Kingdom story. It would explain why Ganondorf found Link's name interesting, because he would have previously killed the hero of Twilight Link. It would also at least help to explain why Ganondorf could shatter the Master Sword, because his Secret Stone could potentially be multiplying the power of the Triforce of Power, which was in the possession of that iteration of Ganondorf. The Master Sword sealed away Demise himself, so Ganondorf shouldn't be able to damage it without some serious foul play and a magnificent level of power. However, at the end of the day, I concluded that this couldn't be the case for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Tears version of Ganondorf displays a very different set of powers than the Ganondorf of Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. Second, there's no evidence that the Ganondorf from Tears of the Kingdom has the Triforce of Power, which we know that the other Ganondorf had. In fact, it is repeatedly hinted at in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom that the entire Triforce is currently suspended in the bloodline of Hylia, because we see the whole thing manifest on Zelda's hand in both games, and because it explains why Breath and Tears Zelda is about 50 times more magically gifted than any of the prior Zeldas. So the Ganondorf of Tears of the Kingdom probably can't be the same Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. However, it still works out nicely because of how Tears Ganondorf matches up with Four Swords Adventures Ganondorf, and the two parallel each other closely enough that if this whole Shadow Timeline theory is correct, then Tears Ganondorf and FSA Ganondorf are almost definitely the same incarnation, just in different timelines. Okay, that's the actual end of the video.